Hello from the land of TV, this is King Kool. This is my top 10 best and worst movies of 2015. I'm going to do the list a little differently this year. I'm going to go from my 10th worst to my 10th best to my 9th worst to my 9th best, and go on like that. I think it'll make it a little more interesting that way. Number 10. There were a lot of movies based on true stories this year. To me, those words might as well be I don't know how to tell you this, or can you come into my office as far as words that fill me with dread. But what was the worst movie based on a real story? Our Brandon's Crisis was terrible and boring, but Billy Bob Thornton was great in it. Pawn Sacrifice was only good towards the end when it was actually about the games of chess and not about his paranoia. They illustrate it like it was a mental illness, but if you look up Bobby Fischer on Wikipedia, it doesn't say he was mentally ill. It just says he made some anti-Semitic and anti-American and some paranoid statements. Maybe he just never got diagnosed, but maybe he was just a jerk. Great title, though. The Letters was a movie made about Mother Teresa that was mighty boring, least of all because it kept reiterating itself as if the commercial breaks were cut out of a television broadcast. In the Heart of the Sea, wasn't that actually based on a true story? If it wasn't, I don't know why it was so freaking boring. Black Mass had a spot down here on the worst list for a while. No matter how good Johnny Depp really was as Bulger, after watching this movie, and especially after reading the book it was based on, I just got the impression that Whitey Bulger is just not that interesting, and neither is his friend in the FBI, John Connolly. They're just sort of ordinary thugs and phonies, you know? There's a scene where Bulger kills a guy in broad daylight, and I thought they must have tarted this up for the movie and credited him for a kill he didn't actually do, but it turns out this is quite likely one of the times when Bulger took care of his own dirty laundry himself. This movie has no insight into how, it's all about the what. But Black Mass got beat out right at the end by number 10 on my worst list. Truth. This movie is about the Killian documents controversy, the forged memo scandal that brought down Dan Rather and Mary Mapes. I refuse to call this scandal Memogate. Any controversy or movement that uses the gate suffix can be safely ignored until they come up with a better name. They went to air with documents that later appear to be forgeries made in Microsoft Word. The front half of this movie works well, until you realize that the movie is on Rather and Mapes' side. By the way, the documents are almost certainly forgeries. They line up perfectly with the same document typed out in 11.5 Times New Roman font in Microsoft Word. Much was made of the superscript TH that appears on numbers like 11th, which some typewriters couldn't do. So they actually found one, and it looks nothing like the one from the memos or from a Word document, but the Word document does match the memo. At some point, Mary Mapes was quoted in this movie, "Our story was about whether the president fulfilled his service, but nobody wants to talk about that. They want to talk about fonts and forgeries, and they hope to God the truth gets lost in the scrum. Nobody wants to talk about the service record, Mrs. Mapes, because by failing to do your job, you made the story about you and your team's failures. Even worse, by presenting the likely forged documents as accurate, you implicitly made it look like the news was making something up to try to influence an election. The only people trying to lose the truth in the scrum are the people who tried to hide their culpability or make excuses or obfuscate the issue in this scandal." Do I believe George W. Bush got preferential treatment in the military and that it was suppressed later on to avoid embarrassment? I sure do. Do I believe it based on information provided in those memos? No. Do documents with such questionable provenance belong in any serious journalism piece? Absolutely not. At the end, she said something to the order of, "These forgeries were made by someone who knows a lot about Bush and the military and etc. etc. Do you think a person who made this good a forgery would just type them up in Word?" Evidently they did. It fooled you, didn't it? It is easier to explain that way than to find a mythical typewriter that can make something identical to 11.5 size Times New Roman, which I'll point out, apparently, there were no fractional font sizes at the time this memo was supposed to have been written. I could go on about this for so long, but the main point is, this movie wants to pretend there was more doubt about the documents themselves than there really is or was. We all know that movies based on true stories tend to get stuff wrong, but this is based on a true story malpractice. If you were to tell me that Paddington would be one of the better kids' movies I'd see this year after I saw the first trailer, I would not have believed you. I walked into that one thinking I was in for another Yogi Bear. But Paddington was actually great and funny. Not exactly top 10 material, but way better than I thought it would be. You could probably say the same thing about the SpongeBob movie, Sponge Out of Water. I never saw the show, it was right when I stopped watching Nicktoons as it came out, but both the movies are pretty good. And Shaun the Sheep was a lot of fun, though I think I understand why it was thrown into the doldrums of August. It's probably very hard to promote a movie with no dialogue. But edging them out, at number 10, is Pixar's non-crappy entry this year, Inside Out. I sort of dispute when people have said this movie is a metaphor for depression. My understanding of depression differs a bit from what goes down here, but nevertheless, this is a charming and emotional movie that works on both of its storytelling levels all the way through. It's great. No, it didn't make me cry, and that's not necessarily the mark of a good movie either. You know what did actually make me cry? Little Boy. But by the end of that movie, it's just not playing fair. It just lays on so thick, it just wore me down. The only other one that came close was The 33, another based on a true story movie that I sort of forgot about earlier. That one's a bit too breathlessly dramatic for me, but I cannot deny it is reasonably effective. Number 9, Private. There's a part of me that actually enjoyed The Loft from January. It's gruesome and sleazy and nasty and has a terrible opinion of women and men. But it's also convoluted and kind of weird, so part of me likes it, despite the fact that it's horrible. I can't really say I hate movies like that, because I sure liked The Hateful Eight, but I only saw that like a few weeks ago. I'm not really comfortable putting it on the list unless I'd really thought about it for a while, but comparing Tarantino to anyone else is just not fair. Then there was The Perfect Guy, the movie about the woman pursued by an insane stalker and ex-flame. The Perfect Guy was pretty good, but it must have the most shockingly dishonest synopsis I have ever read. I quote this directly from IMDb, apparently written by Sony Pictures Entertainment. After a painful breakup, successful lobbyist Leah Vaughn, Sanaa Lathan, jumps into a passionate relationship with a charming stranger, Michael Ealy. When her ex-boyfriend, Morris Chestnut, resurfaces in her life, she has to figure out who she should trust and who she should fear. Okay, that's not how that goes down in this movie at all. That is a total lie. Now, I'm totally okay with sleaze, as long as it's done right, or at least, a little bit of fun, or at least it's interesting in the moment, which is the reason, again, why I'm giving The Loft a pass. But if you make something sleazy, but you think it's art, well, that's when you get movies like number 9 on my worst list. Secret in Their Eyes. Without talking too much about the plot, this is about a murder investigation that stalled and allowed the main suspect to walk away. Now they have to try to get the guy now that they think he's resurfaced. A lot of movies based on books have this problem for me, like Along Came a Spider. There's just a certain point where what works in a book comes off as gross in a movie. I don't want to give away some of the surprises, and yeah, there's a few. It's a thriller, after all, but the fact of the matter is, when it comes to the end, and you see how they decide to resolve what went down, it's in the weakest way imaginable, given this revelation. This movie thinks it's art, when all it is manipulative and gross. It was the only movie this year that actually made my skin crawl. Getting back to good movies based on true stories, there were actually quite a few. There was an alarming number that said right at the start, this is based on a true story, as if we wouldn't believe it without that. I think Captain might have been the first one I saw doing that. That's a trend I would love to not see continue in the new year. Everest and The Walk feel kind of like counterparts. Everest is very matter-of-fact and unassuming, where The Walk is fanciful and visual and has its head in the clouds. Both are decent, though Everest was the only movie that actually made me cry out, Jesus Christ, in the theater. Then there was True Story, which got right to the nub of the matter, but got outdone by the end of the tour as far as two mostly comedic actors inexplicably cast in dramas. Then there was The Danish Girl, which had its heart in the right place, but the script reads like a second draft. And then there was The Big Short, which is actually really good. Apparently, to get The Big Short made, Adam McKay had to make Anchorman 2. And to me, that's like, you can have this here pizza, but only if you spend an hour in a hot tub with Kristen Bell and Amanda Peet. And they're really interested to hear about the Nintendo 64. Okay, you twisted my arm. Legend was much better than Black Mass, at least in that it dealt with the Cray brothers being psychopaths in far more interesting ways. And when violence went down in Legend, it was actually shocking. It wasn't the inevitable result of Whitey Bulger being nice to someone and then immediately killing them. They pulled that trick about 5 times in Black Mass, and this is what I mean when I say Whitey Bulger isn't interesting. For one of the best examples of a movie based on a true story this year, number 9 on my best list, Straight Outta Compton. Yeah, apparently this movie buffs out a lot of Dr. Dre's problems with women, and the movie is produced by Dre and Ice Cube themselves. Is this really the way to tell this story? Well, it's got fabulous performances from Paul Giamatti, O'Shea Jackson Jr., Corey Hawkins, and Jason Mitchell. And most crucially, watching this movie, you understand why this groundbreaking movement was important. It's almost surprising to see how controversial it all was at the time. It seems a little tame for nowadays standards. But what clinched it for me was the scene towards the end when Dre sees people acting like fools in the offices of Death Row Records, and he says something to the order of, You guys are acting like idiots, killing each other, dogfighting, threatening to kill each other, whatever. We could have done this when we was broke! I know there's a lot of details in the movie that are probably wrong or probably been left out, like the fact that Ice Cube had like a second group that he joined later on. They don't even mention him. And maybe The Big Short should be at this place instead of this one. But it was that line that got this movie on the top 10.
Number 8.
Believe it or not, you won't find Pixels on this worst list. Not because it isn't awful, but at least it was bad in a way that sort of intrigued me. It's sort of like playing with a Rubik's Cube or something. Whatever hate I had sort of dissipated after I tore it apart in a couple of big Facebook posts. Nor is Paul Blart Mall Cop 2 on here. My severe disappointment with that movie was my own damn fault. I actually liked the original, but I was foolish to get my hopes up. Hotel Transylvania 2 didn't exactly disappoint, but neither did it go anywhere really interesting. How many movies have you seen that start and end with the exact same song? But it's perfectly acceptable, and it is occasionally hilarious. Minions either needed less minions or more, and I can't tell which. I guess if there wasn't a giant mob of them, we wouldn't get that sequence where they all sing Make 'Em Laugh, which was my favorite part. If you want the worst that kids' movies have to offer, you'll have to do worse than the frankly disastrous The Good Dinosaur, which is the worst Pixar movie since The First Car, possibly the worst one they've ever made. But if Pixar really wants to make unwatchable kids' movies, they need look no further than their competitors at DreamWorks, the makers of number 8 on my list. Home. The worst kids' movie of the year. More like a music video than a movie. It's annoying and chaotic, and its tiny voice cast is filled with actors who need more seasoning before being asked to carry a whole movie like this. Rihanna is barely passable, and I still have no idea how old her character is supposed to be. And Jim Parsons is, I am convinced, the most limited comic talent to headline an animated feature until they get Andrew Dice Clay to play a pair of animated fuzzy dice. I know that Jim Parsons didn't write the main character to have badly conjugated English, but a character this annoying needed a larger cast to give us some breathing room. I said the thing about Hotel Transylvania about how it starts and ends with the same song, basically bookending it by saying, nothing's changed. Well, this movie does that too. The credit song is also in the first scene in the opening titles. The best I can say about it is, it's not as bad as The Nut Job. I mentioned how Shaun the Sheep probably deserved a better release date than August, but it might have been too difficult to market. The same could probably be said of The Gift, which is actually really good, but I suppose I didn't know what to expect of any movie written and directed by Joel Edgerton. Whereas Ricky and the Flash and The Man from U.N.C.L.E. are both worthy of their bad release date. They are lame. Maybe I just don't get the 60s, so maybe I was too hard on U.N.C.L.E., but Ricky and the Flash is legitimately bad despite Meryl Streep's great performance. Selfless is a movie that nobody saw. It's about Ben Kingsley transferring his conscience to the body of a young man played by Ryan Reynolds. But, and I may be giving this movie way too much credit, I think the movie is a metaphor for soldiers coming home from military service with PTSD. Daddy comes home with a different personality, he takes his pills that make him feel more like himself, the relationship with his family is strained because of his service and his choices. I think the reason it got a bad release date is, it's not much of an action movie at all. I don't know if that was the point or if the filmmakers were simply more interested in the ideas than the bullets. Personally, I think it works all the way through as far as science fiction and as an allegory. It has a good villain who slowly turns more evil and less forgivable as the movie progresses. It's not a great action movie, and it takes a preposterous turn when one of the underlings pulls out an honest-to-God flamethrower, but they manage to pull it off. I thoroughly enjoyed Selfless. I'm putting it on the list at number 8, but if it doesn't appear on anyone else's best list, I would not be surprised.
Numero 7. Oh, excuse me. This doesn't normally happen to me.
I would be very skeptical of anyone who puts Kingsman: The Secret Service on their best list. At the end of the day, I have to concede it is a good action movie, but it is crucially flawed. I could do a full video on Kingsman, and maybe I will someday, but in brief, it's a movie based on a comic book that defies storytelling expectation, but the story beats here are all predictable because they're like a young adult novel, like Percy Jackson or something. And that one scene everyone talks about? Look, it's not nearly as much fun for me to watch a superior hero take out a bunch of untrained foes as it is to watch a hero take on a superior villain. That's why I actually cheered in Little Boy when he hit the bully in the face with his metal lunchbox, but never when Colin Firth kills 100 untrained, uneducated churchgoers. That's like taking a thrill watching someone shoot down a wooden duck at a carnival game. And this movie is just so pleased with itself. Anyway, Kingsman isn't even really bad, it just frustrates me. There are lots of bad action movies every year, but to be memorable after a whole year's passed, you need something special. Black Hat was bad, but I'll be damned if I remember anything about it. Point Break was stupid, but apparently still pretty different from the original. Hitman Agent 47 was a candidate for this list. It's stupid as hell, and I really don't know why they let Skip Woods back into the franchise. But Hitman is slightly better and more audacious than The Transporter Refueled, which doesn't even have Jason Statham this time. He apparently wanted too much money, so they replaced him with this golem with no charisma and all his hair. But then again, Refueled did have one good action scene. But then there was also Run All Night, which was kinda bad, if only because Joel Kinnaman's presence as a star still baffles me. But none of them are quite as bad as number 7 on my worst list, Taken 3. I've now seen all of Olivier Megaton's English language movies, and let me tell you, he's directed less comprehensible action scenes than I have. They say his trademark is intentionally disorienting action scenes. This isn't Edge of Tomorrow, where it gives you a sense of the chaos. This is just shaking it around to cover up the fact that you have nothing interesting to show us. Megaton was apparently a former graffiti artist, and I believe it, since 3 of his 4 English movies are him messing up someone else's property. But that wouldn't get it on the list all by itself. What does get this onto the list is how casually Brian Mills tortures his wife's second husband to get him to tell him something. He waterboards him to get him to give up the secret, and they're on the same side. They're not exactly friends, and it turns out this guy did get his wife killed, but he's not the guy they're looking for. This isn't torturing the human trafficker in Taken 1, this is just senseless. Maybe Olivier Megaton is the graffiti artist spraying a bunch of paint on something that does not belong to him. But Luc Besson is the guy who decided that he likes how it looks. Good action is hard to come by sometimes, but then again, we had some decent ones this year. I was one of the crazies who didn't think Terminator Genisys was all that bad, but I feel like the second I start to pick at it, it will all unravel like a cheap cardigan. The Last Witch Hunter was a blast with a really interesting fantasy world and story, but the action's not that great. Furious 7's action was better, but there's that one scene where the car jumps through the skyscrapers, and then it power slides and knocks over a bunch of statues. Those are supposed to be the terracotta soldiers that were buried with Qin Shi Huang, first emperor of China from the 3rd century BC. No, Furious 7, that's not fun. You just destroyed something that lasted for millennia before you showed up. I know they didn't really destroy them, but that's supposed to be exciting? Destroying priceless artifacts? Take that, Guernica! I saw Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 2 without having seen the other parts, but I got into it within about 2 minutes. Take notes, Maze Runner The Scorched Trials, you dull crapola. No Escape was also surprisingly tense, if a little troublesome in its portrayal of the young men of this unidentified country taking up arms for a violent revolt. Now, I think there will always be young men in any country who can't wait to take up sticks and have the excuse to beat people up, so I don't necessarily agree that this portrayal is racist. But if I must stick my neck out to stick up for the weird political machinations of a Hollywood movie, why don't I do it for one that doesn't actually have it in the movie? Number 7 on my best list is Mission Impossible: Rogue Nation. This is a really excellent action spy thriller that once again proves why, no matter what happens outside the movie theater, Tom Cruise is a movie star's movie star. He again teamed up with Christopher McQuarrie, who also directed Jack Reacher, which was also really good. It's got lots of interesting action, locations, gadgets, etc. Okay, it's not interesting to talk about necessarily without going, and then this happened, and then that happened. But that shot when he hangs onto the plane, you thought might have been like the end of the movie, that's the opening. Ethan Hunt has pretty much out-Bonded James Bond this year, but we'll get back to that.
I'd like to play a vowel. What?
A lot of critics seem to think that there's nothing worse than a bad comedy. I think that comes from the fact that comedies so seldom have anything else to offer. When you have movies like Ant-Man, which are hilarious and pretty good action movies, boy, do these comedies look pretty pathetic. Even American Ultra did okay in that category. Speaking of action comedies, I think it'd be completely out of line to put, say, Mordecai on a worst list. Mordecai is a miscalculation. It doesn't work. It's not very funny, it's not exciting, but it's not remotely one of the worst movies of this year. Then there was Get Hard, the better of the 2 Kevin Hart comedies this year, but still not really good. Only 3 comedies this year failed to make me laugh even once. I mean even a snort or a chuckle, nothing. Hot Pursuit, which did make me laugh once in the bloopers, but too little way too late. Rock the Casbah, which I've heard people call a farce.
No way, absolutely not, okay? Love the Coopers is more of a farce than Rock the Casbah. You know what was a legit farce? Friends and Romans. Did that come out anywhere but Rhode Island? I don't know.
Friends and Romans is about actors who always get stuck in wise guy and mobster roles, trying to make their own version of Julius Caesar, and then a real mobster accidentally gets folded into the mix, and people think that the actors might be real mobsters, so the FBI gets involved. And see, that's how you do a farce. It's continually escalating stakes and misunderstandings that snowball completely out of control. It's not Bill Murray wandering through unfunny Afghan set pieces with all the interest of a kid on a school trip to the aquarium. He doesn't care about fish. The actual plot of bringing the woman onto like Afghan Idol doesn't start literally until the movie is half over. Anyway, where was I? Rock the Casbah legitimately almost made this list, and Hot Pursuit sucks, but you know what, big deal.
But neither of those films are as staggeringly unfunny as number 6 on my worst list. Unfinished Business. Unfinished Business may be the least successful comedy I've ever seen. I haven't seen anything like it since, like, Failure to Launch.
Vince Vaughn cannot catch a break. Now, I hated Delivery Man, but that wasn't as bad as this, although it was really, really bad. This movie labors so hard to make situations that should be funny but really aren't. It feels like a Seltzer-Friedberg spoof to a movie that I've never seen, or maybe like an avant-garde drama that somehow got Vince Vaughn stuck in it. Or like a movie made by extraterrestrials who just don't understand humor or irony. I sat there, my mouth open, my fingers steepled, my brow lowered, waiting for something to go right for this movie. And it never did. And when the movie was over, I thought to myself, well, that's the worst movie of the year. No movie could possibly top that.
And it's just number 6.
It's saying something when Spy and Ted 2 were two of the better comedies I saw this year, and they're both just sort of decent. Spy at least got me more comfortable with the notion of this new, like, all-female Ghostbusters we got coming out, which has the same director. By the way, you shouldn't object to this new Ghostbusters they're making just because they cast all women. You should be aware of any Ghostbusters sequel because you saw Ghostbusters 2. Towards the end of the year, I started to wonder if I was just a crab and I just don't like movies the way I used to. Then I saw The Night Before, a comedy I had no expectations for, and I laughed my head off. And honest to God, the funniest scene in any movie this year was in Magic Mike XXL, and anyone who saw it knows exactly what scene I'm talking about. Then again, they set a striptease to Closer by 9 Inch Nails, and I can scarcely think of a less erotic song.
No, me no gusta.
Did you notice that there were practically no romantic comedies this year? When I type Romantic Comedy 2015 into Google, look what comes up. Brooklyn, that ultra-boring, steakless snore. I mean, I guess it kind of was like a romantic comedy when she pooped in that bucket, but that could be considered a spoiler. Focus, Aloha, The Wedding Ringer, these aren't romantic comedies. Mississippi Grind was more romantic than those movies. Then there was Mistress America, or as I like to call it, Just Kiss Already! Then there was The D-Train, which defies all explanation.
I suppose you could call Trainwreck romantic comedy, but that actually feels really friggin' unfair because it's actually legitimately hilarious and romantic and heartfelt, and it's number 6 on my best list. It is the best comedy I saw all year. Amy Schumer is the most interesting comedian of her generation, and I cannot wait to see what she has in store for us next.
Number 5! If you're wondering, the low watermark for my worst list was Chappie. I have to be able to say that a movie was definitely worse than Chappie, or it can't go on the worst list. Now, Chappie's bad. Chappie's ridiculous and dumb and pretty much awful. But at least it was sort of interesting. That's actually the reason The Martian didn't make the list. I enjoyed The Martian quite a bit all the way through. I think you should watch it too. But I've barely given it another thought since I saw it. The low watermark for my best list is Ex Machina. Now, Ex Machina was pretty good, but again, I've barely thought about it since seeing it. And I think it was outdone by 2 movies that I saw on Netflix Instant, The Machine and Automata. You should give them a watch, too.
But the worst science fiction film of last year has to go to number 5 on my worst list. Tomorrowland.
Tomorrowland's intrigue is all in the marketing. Once you start watching it, you get dragged along on this stupid adventure that's about as deep as an airport novel, but so self-important and up its own ass, you just want to shake it. The whole movie hinges on the mystery of what will happen once they get back to Tomorrowland. And once we get there, this is what we've been building up to? Tomorrowland was written in part by Damon Lindelof, who also gave us the unforgivable Star Trek Into Darkness. He appears to be the master of building up intrigue about almost nothing. This movie is dull, self-important, surprisingly stupid, and yet it keeps talking about how cool everything will be once we get there, and it doesn't remotely pull it off. But There is one good action scene in it. About halfway through, we have a big fight scene in George Clooney's house. Normally, I would leave a movie with a scene this good off the list. For instance, Joy didn't make the list, and Joy is almost unbearable, but it has about 10 minutes where it's good in the middle, right when Bradley Cooper finally shows up. When's the last time you could say that a movie got good once Bradley Cooper showed up?
Tomorrowland is worse than Ex Machina. It is worse than Interstellar, and yes, it's worse than Chappie. That's why Tomorrowland made the list, and Chappie didn't.
There was a time when The Hobbit, The Battle of Five Armies was on my worst list. These movies just eventually started to feel like homework. It's just not so special this time around. But there are plenty of terrible movies that didn't make the list and aren't better than The Hobbit 3, so I just eventually had to get out of my own way. So if I said Mad Max Fury Road was number 5 on my list, nobody would be shocked, right? Unless you thought it was supposed to be number 1. But here's the thing, it actually wasn't going to make the list until I saw it a second time. I had so much trouble understanding what people were saying, and I'm not as big on car chases as other people are. But then I watched it a second time with friends and subtitles, and I realized, man, what was I thinking? This is awesome! Yes, I think it's easier to straight up enjoy something like Mission Impossible, but I can't put that above this. This is the most exciting and interesting action movie since John Wick.
Which, now that I think about it, John Wick should not have been below 22 friggin' Jump Street on my best list. I don't know what the hell I was thinking last year. But Mad Max is weird, it's crazy, it's a ton of fun, and best of all, it got people to shut up about Star Wars for one damn day. We'll talk about Star Wars higher up on the list. Ooh, but which list? Will it be best or worst? Ooh.
2015 was the first year I actually started to watch horror movies. Unlike every other movie fan in the world, I didn't start watching horror movies when I was a zygote, so I'm still pretty squeamish. The best one I saw was probably It Follows, an interesting movie hampered by the worst soundtrack of any movie I've seen since John Q. Not that I know anything about music, mind. Or horror, for that matter. I also rather enjoyed Crimson Peak, which is a shockingly beautiful movie, and Unfriended, which is an interesting take on the found footage genre. In stark contrast to that, The Gallows is a shallow, stupid, obnoxious found footage movie with the most unlikable high schoolers getting picked off one by one. If I was playing fair, The Gallows would be right here at number 4. But this year also brought us The Visit, the 9th feature film by M. Night Shyamalan, and the 6th bad one in a row. The Visit is terrible and stupid and found footage movie. I don't know what possessed Shyamalan to make a found footage movie when even his bad movies were usually pretty well shot. This took the one thing he still had going for him and locked off the shot on tripods or shaky handheld cam. It is inexplicable. Now, The Visit is probably worse than The Gallows, but The Gallows was more obnoxious and disposable. But The Gallows was an independent production by amateurs. Maybe they're not exactly amateurs, but the term feels right in this context. Then there was the totally boring Paranormal Activity, The Ghost Dimension, which even the irreplaceable Olivia Taylor-Dudley could not save. She did much better in The Vatican Tapes, which isn't great, but at least had enough sense to use found footage only when it made sense to use it. But I didn't see the other Paranormal Activity movies, so maybe that's why I thought this one was boring. But then there was the purposefully unpleasant Goodnight Mommy, and the juvenile and disgusting Scout's Guide to the Zombie Apocalypse, which might actually be worse than either The Visit or The Gallows.
The fact of the matter is, I don't really know what makes a good horror movie. Like, my taste buds are very new and uncultured for this sort of thing. Maybe The Gallows is a masterpiece. I doubt it. But for this year only, I'm going to leave all the horror movies off the list. And all the PG-13 style horror movies like, I suppose The Visit and The Lazarus Effect and all those things, none of them are going to make the list. They all get a get out of jail free card just this year. So it is number 4 on my worst list. Appropriately enough, Fantastic Four.
I knew this movie was in trouble when we start with the flashback to Reed Richards as a kid, the super scientist kid developing something amazing, which is actually worse than the one in Tomorrowland, despite how completely ridiculous that sequence was. At least that one didn't have Ben Grimm's older brother beating him up and saying, "It's clobberin' time." That line got this movie off on the wrong foot right away, and it never found its way back. This movie doesn't want to be the other Fantastic Four movies, not because it thinks those movies are bad, but because it wants to be distinct. But this movie has no opinion of the Fantastic Four at all. The 4 main characters are all untouchable, emotionless ciphers who speak only in brief moments of sarcasm, only to be used to show how little anything means to them, because God forbid they give a damn about something and face disillusion. I could handle a grim, dark, self-important Fantastic Four if that's what they were going to try to do, but this movie has no opinion of the Fantastic Four. It doesn't understand the Fantastic Four, so it cannot enforce nor subvert the themes because they don't understand what those themes are. This movie just reeks of disinterest and compulsion.
And yet this movie is pants-pissingly terrified that we won't take it seriously. They make asinine decisions like, the Thing can't wear pants, that'll be too silly. So I guess now the Thing just doesn't have a penis. So this movie just acts like it's got all this important stuff to say. Not because it has important things to say, but just because that's the in vogue thing to do, I guess. Is to act like you have something to say. Josh Trank on Twitter said that he had a better version of this movie a year ago. I don't believe him. Show me one scene, 1 second, one atom of this movie that works. It's not there. This movie sucks, but even if it was the version that he definitely wanted to make, I have a feeling that version was not much better.
There are still more movies based on true stories to get through this year. Bridge of Spies was really good, with a fabulous performance from Mark Rylance, who didn't actually impress me at all in The Gunman from March, but here I wouldn't be surprised if he got nominated for Best Supporting Oscar. Woman in Gold is decent, with good performances. Apparently, Ryan Reynolds' character was going to be first played by Andrew Garfield. I can't imagine taking this movie seriously if someone that young was in the role. I know that Andrew Garfield's not actually that much younger than Ryan Reynolds, but, Ryan Reynolds can't play a 20-year-old anymore ever since Van Wilder, so... Whereas Andrew Garfield totally could. It's also got Katie Holmes in a thankless role that she nevertheless is no good in.
Don't ever forget that Katie Holmes is a bad actress.
When I saw Steve Jobs with my friend, at the end of it, he turned to me and said, "You hated that." No, I really didn't. I just hate Steve Jobs, the guy, the man who soldered all these computers together to make them about as modular as the Super Nintendo, and used stupid metaphors about art and things to make excuses about it. I hate that philosophy. I liked the movie quite a bit. It almost made the list. Then there was Concussion, which is pretty good, but a touch melodramatic for me. There's something that happens in this movie where I just had to stop and ask, did this really happen? I couldn't confirm it online, so I frankly don't know. Trumbo was a real contender for a spot on this list. It's about Dalton Trumbo and the Hollywood Blacklist. Not the Hollywood Blacklist of unproduced but promising screenplays, which we all know how I feel about that. But this is the one where it's like you'd get in the blacklist if you were a communist back in the 60s, you know. As far as which blacklist was worse, I don't know. But anyway, when looking up stuff about this movie, I saw that Trumbo got a really important detail wrong. In this movie, Edward G. Robinson named when he's called in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee. In real life, he was called several times, but he never did that. He never named names. This is a really important thing to get right. This is a man's integrity they're messing with here. Now, at the end of the movie, it's clear that even if this were true, those forced to name names were victims of a terrible injustice themselves. But this is the sort of fact that really gets under my skin when you get something this important wrong.
With that in mind, number 4 on my best list. Spotlight, the complete opposite of Truth. Truth the movie, not Truth the concept. Man, they have some nerve calling that movie friggin' Truth. Nerve, ooh. I didn't even mean to make that pun.
Spotlight is a great and understated movie about a cover-up that went on far, far too long. Think of how many ways the Catholic Church sex scandal could have just broken, but every time it either stalled or got covered up or something until so many people knew about it, it was just aching to break open like an old pumpkin. And yet, the movie is not salacious or gross about what happens. It's upfront about horrible details, but trusts us to feel the frustration and disgust for ourselves that we might have let wane in the intervening years since the scandal finally broke. And best of all, it's about how much work goes into proper journalism. They refuse to go after them until they've crossed every T and dotted every I.
Nobody remembers who got the story first, but everyone remembers who got the story wrong.
Number 3. Sometimes the thing that saves a movie from being on the worst list is just one good scene. That's why Tomorrowland is only in spot 5. Seventh Son has one good set of lines somewhere in the middle, but it's otherwise pretty forgettable. Gem and the Holograms is awash in music movie cliches, and cheap references to the cartoon, and just plain bad ideas, and I pretty much hated it. But after the whole movie is done, they do the Marvel thing at the end where they tease the sequel that they clearly will not get a chance to do now, and there's one piece of casting that is so absolutely perfect that it saved this movie from the worst list.
But to be this high on the worst list, you have to have absolutely nothing going for you. And that's certainly the case for number 3 on my worst list. Pan.
I wasn't really looking forward to Pan, but the only thing I was looking forward to was seeing Amanda Seyfried in the credits and thinking, oh, maybe she's going to be Tinkerbell. That would be pretty good casting. Nope. The opening dashes that right away when she appears as Peter's mother, who of course breaks up the reflection of the moon in a puddle before leaving Peter at the orphanage run by deliberately malevolent nuns and promising she'll be back or something. And this is before the opening narration says something to the order of, "This isn't the story that you know," because that worked so well for Victor Frankenstein.
By the way, Victor Frankenstein, not good, but didn't deserve to bomb nearly as hard as it did. Like, it's better than Dracula Untold. Dracula Untold did great. You know, that one deserved a bomb. This one didn't.
It's not that this movie has absolutely no ideas, and it's not that most of the story is the destined hero's journey we've seen way too often and is totally boring. It's the fact that the few ideas it has are completely ridiculous. Pixie dust is now like this mineral that Blackbeard is using slaves to mine to help keep him young. He inhales this dust through this big elaborate mask, and then he's young again. They do this once, and it never comes back up. When they're mining, they're also all singing "Smells Like Teen Spirit" for some reason. Again, a grim Peter Pan could work, but I don't think that's what they were trying to do. They certainly weren't trying to flaunt storytelling conventions. When Hook, who is actually his friend in this movie, and his actual name is James Hook, but he's got both his hands, but he also has a hook that he uses, because apparently when they found out his name was James Hook, they gave him a hook. Anyway, when Hook bails before the last battle, he's like, "I can't go, we gotta go do this," and it looks like Pan's in trouble during the last battle, and someone flies in to help him, I wonder if it's Hook on his own ship or something.
I literally said aloud in the theater, well, who didn't see that coming? Now, this movie is worse than Fantastic Four, because... Is it? Hang on, look at my thing. Okay, like, I didn't like almost anything in this movie, but I liked, like, a moment or two in Fantastic Four. Like, this is the point when Michael B. Jordan holds his fist out for a fist bump, and Miles Teller sort of pats it like that. Like, that was funny, but that's a tiny cookie crumb in a giant vacuum bag full of dust. So it's like, and Pan is more ruthlessly cliched, like, Fantastic Four isn't that cliched, but Pan has a couple of ideas, they're just terrible ideas, and they're not really supported by the rest of the movie. Pan's all over the place, but it's not boring. Fantastic Four is deathly boring. You know what? Screw this. They're tied, okay? I'm going to put them both on number 4 on this list. And you know what? If we can have one tie, let's tie another one. I'm going to tie Spotlight to Trumbo. Now, I have reservations about Trumbo because of this, factual inaccuracy, but I don't believe that was like them trying to trick people. It was just something that they actually did as a creative license or something. This isn't like Truth, where they're simply trying to make something that simply isn't true. This is still, I think, a very good movie about paranoia and doing what's right and things like that. I'm actually surprised it didn't get a Best Oscar nomination for Best Picture, because I thought they were all about, like, congratulating filmmakers and congratulating themselves, basically, on Hollywood. Look how good we are. Like, with Argo and The Artist and Birdman, it seemed like it would have been a shoo-in, but, I guess it shows how much I know about Oscar. I was right that Mark Rylance got a Best Supporting Actor nomination for Bridge of Spies. As you can see, I said that in the recording. I could go back and change that, but I bet I'm not gonna, cause this is taking so long to do. Loo. I whacked my elbow on the TV. Oh crap, I don't have a third worst movie anymore. What should it be?
Could it be Sisters, the shockingly mean-spirited comedy from last month they clearly had so much confidence in they put it up against Star Wars, and then it got beaten by Daddy's Home of all things? Daddy's Home is actually probably the best comedy that either Will Ferrell or Mark Wahlberg made this year. But not John Cena, whose cameo in Sisters is the only part I laughed at. I normally wouldn't spoil that, but... whatever. Sisters would be a pretty good choice, but what about Burnt, which is Bradley Cooper as the biggest jerk of a chef who nevertheless is so skilled everyone has to put up with his abuse, sometimes actual literal physical abuse. Why am I interested in his redemption if he's not going to grow or change his horrible behavior at all? Burnt is basically the Bizarro World equivalent to Chef from last year. When people were talking about the audiences for Entourage, they would often use the pejorative term douches. Now, it's not just calling someone a douche the way you call someone an idiot or whatever. It's starting to get the uncomfortable feeling of a slur, as in these douches dress a certain way and have certain hairstyles and listen to certain kinds of music. I wish you could avoid this sort of stereotyping even for something as innocuous as this. By the way, Entourage was, decent. And even if the characters are douches, well, they're not jerks like they are in Sisters or Burnt. They're just trying to get their piece of the Hollywood pie.
Could Hollywood really produce a main character as loathsome as the one in Burnt, and put him in a comedy with this weird mean streak like Sisters? I believe that they did. With number 3 on my worst list, Hot Tub Time Machine 2.
Hot Tub Time Machine was a pretty good movie, but the sequel shows it was apparently a complete accident. thoroughly mean and pointlessly vulgar. It's basically, what if Marty McFly was a tool? Tool doesn't do justice to how unlikable Rod Corddry's character is in this movie, and now he's the main character now that John Cusack has flown the coop. IMDb used to say that John Cusack wasn't even approached to be in this movie, and my response at the time was, and I quote, "Well, for neglecting to include him, deliberately or not, I suspect John Cusack will send the makers of Hot Tub Time Machine 2 a fruit basket the size of a wheelbarrow." But apparently, he's in the unrated cut of the movie. Instead of ending with Patriot Lou...
Okay, don't you complain to me about spoilers, okay? They're the ones who put, like, Patriot Lou in the commercials for, like, the Super Bowl, when they're like, hey, the Super Bowl, let's make some Patriot deflated ball joke. Zonk, what a gaff, it'll never get old!
Anyway, instead of Patriot Lou coming out of the time portal, it's John Cusack appears to tease the third part, and to hopefully complete the Back to the Future made by mean, vulgar asswipes checklist. I wasn't grinding my teeth during this movie like I was during Pan, and the words "run out of town on a rail" weren't on my mind like with Fantastic Four. So why is this worse? Because I believe the makers of Pan and Fantastic Four were actually trying. This is lazy, poisonous, and totally unnecessary filmmaking. Considering the turmoil its production went through, the fact that Ant-Man is as good as it is surprising. We keep waiting for Marvel to make a misstep and it doesn't happen. If you saw my list last year, it should be no surprise that number 3 on my best list is The Age of Adeline.
Sorry, excuse me, Ultron. Age of Ultron. You know, Avengers 2. I wonder if, they deliberately released Age of Adeline 1 week before Age of Ultron to see if you get people walking, all the confused comic book fans walking in and being like, this is a really weird origin story about this woman who lives forever. Age of Adeline is actually pretty good, but anyway, if it was up to me, I would release all the movies with similar titles right near each other. I'd have A Walk in the Woods and The Walk and Into the Woods all come out on the same weekend and just watch people just be like, where am I going?
Again, really good action is kind of hard to come by these days if it's not coming from Marvel, but it's still not really interesting to describe it. And I know some people just don't like Joss Whedon's writing, but this has got more zip in a single scene than all of Fantastic Four. It's the apex of what a modern blockbuster can be in this climate, and I happen to like that. Also, it's got killer robots and Hulkbuster armor. It's probably not actually better than either Winter Soldier or Guardians of the Galaxy, but it's still a ton of fun, and it's a good crescendo for Marvel's second phase.
I know someone out there is going to say, are you saying that Avengers 2 is better than Mad Max? Not exactly, okay? Like, this just shows how arbitrary most top 10 lists are at the end of the day. Like, what it is that you have to pick a criteria that is what you decide to make one thing above the other. So for me, what it is which movie did I have the most fun with? And for me, that movie is Avengers. I had more fun at Avengers than Mad Max. I think Mad Max will end up being more important down the line as far as, like, where it will take action cinema from there. But, like, I just gotta be honest with myself, and I did like Avengers more. Like I said, I wasn't even gonna put Mad Max on the best list until I watched it a second time. Maybe when I watch it a third time, I'll be like, oh, I should have put this here or there. And it just shows, you know, like, top 10 lists are basically, this is what I felt at this exact moment when I was writing this for maybe like a month, until I started to second guess myself, this should have been here, this should have been there. So it's like, these things are snapshots in time that you're like, okay, that's how I felt at this time. And 2 years from now, I'll be like, did I like the Hulkbuster that much that I was going to put it this high on the list? And then I'll rewatch the scene with the Hulkbuster, and I'll be like, yes, I did! Yay, Hulkbuster! Number 2.
Paper Towns was a crucially flawed movie for me, in that the whole movie is about this guy who is trying to find this girl whom he is enchanted with after a fun night sneaking out. The problem is that the girl he's chasing is totally not worth it. The whole plan she has at the start is to humiliate and torment people whom have wronged her because she got cheated on, because of course. She takes a picture of her now ex-boyfriend naked and compares his genitals to Rhode Island. Rich in history, but not large.
Oh yeah, and you had sex with him. Or maybe not, I don't know.
Taking the picture is bad enough, but the guy uses it to legitimately blackmail him. At the end of this ridiculous adventure, the main girl says something so arrogant I had to text it to myself to make certain I would remember it. I've lived here 11 years and never met anyone who cares about what matters.
Yeah, what's important in life? Like revenge.
The scene in Goosebumps where they sneak out is better than this one. Actually, Goosebumps is actually pretty good. And they both have Halston Sage, a terrifyingly beautiful young actress who was also in Scout's Guide, sadly. She got stuck playing the same character in all 3 movies, the object of awkward teenage affection.
Paper Towns isn't even really bad, but it certainly isn't remotely as bad. It's number 2 on my worst list. Me and Earl and the Dying Girl.
I've scarcely ever felt as much annoyance from a single movie than I did during this one. It's about a teenager who makes the films with his friend Earl, all of which are just remakes of old movies with joke titles, like Boba Fett's Feast, something like that. His mother makes him hang out with a girl who has cancer. His parents have such interesting lives that they come across more like objects for the plot than people. They can't do a single thing like a regular person. They can't drink water if they can drink evaporated reclaimed grass runoff or some crap. His dad is basically Wilson from Home Improvement. The teens have esoteric tastes in movies because they're snobs for whom Cartoon Network is apparently not good enough. They eat lunch with their professor rather than their classmates, and yet he feels like he gets along with all the cliques of geeks or nerds or preppies or whatever in the high school environment by condescending to them. And then you realize what this kid's problem is. He is a narcissist. He legitimately thinks he's better than everyone else. Everything he does is to show how smart and special and quirky he is. He's a phony. I had a terrible high school experience, but I treated everyone with enough respect to at least be straight up with them about what I felt about them, if I felt anything at all. These pointless, unwatchable, asinine movies he makes with his friend, they are the perfect metaphor for this whole movie. It's art done not for the sake of the art, or even for the sake of the artist, but for the sake of being the kind of guy who would make a movie called Rasho Man, a movie about a rash-based superhero.
Help me, Rasho Man, I'm itchy! No, that's not how I remember it. Freaking just watch The Duff.
I actually think The Duff was pretty good. It's about a girl who goes through her own bad high school experience, but still comes out as a positive person who somehow found the will to not hate the people who surround her. Even freaking Cinderella was a better story about withstanding the struggles of youth.
And now, a true story. When I saw this movie, I was sitting pretty far up front, but there was one lady in front of me, and I must have coughed or groaned or something towards the end. I must have did something, and she heard me, turned around, held out her hand, and offered me a tissue. And the thing I learned that day is that apparently I cannot silently and hatefully glower at someone so hard that they turn to stone. If I was ever going to do it, it would have been right then.
I've been using other movies I saw this year to give intros to the movies on the list. I could talk about how The Intern was pretty good and a very optimistic movie without being an uplifting one, somehow. But frankly, the best intro for my second favorite movie of the year is just to say, what if we had the Bizarro World version of Me and Earl and the Dying Girl? What if we had a movie where the main character is hardworking and driven rather than self-absorbed? What if he allowed himself to have friends and enemies rather than trying to be so aloof? What if he was sincerely creative instead of making scores of unwatchable movies that give you nothing that the pun in the title couldn't tell you? What if the throwbacks to the older fashioned were sincere rather than a painful effort to be as quirky as possible? What if it was exciting instead of tedious, tense instead of annoying? And what if the plot started because the characters were forced to do something bad instead of something good?
Well, then you'd have number 2 on my best list. Dope. A terrific movie about young, geeky black kids who have to deal with the cultural expectations of both being black and being geeky.
The three characters stumble upon something that complicates their lives after stepping just a bit outside their comfort zone. Now, there's a scene halfway through where the main character Malcolm gets further into this world and he finds a half-naked seductress. Now, in a lesser movie, this would be where the character loses his virginity. In fact, I'm pretty sure that's what happened in We Are Your Friends, but I've forgotten everything about that movie, and so has everyone else. But in this movie, Malcolm quickly figures out, wait, she's very pretty, but she's also a disgusting drug addict, and it did not go the way that he thought it would. Dope has one scene that might not need to be there that's a bit cliched towards the end. Andre of Black Nerd Comedy pointed it out and points out very accurately the scene doesn't actually change anything that happens in the end of the movie. But nevertheless, this is an awesome movie that you should definitely make time for.
Hero, when you let Minion take spot 1, did you remember that Minion has no voice?
I like to solve the puzzle, Alex.
Chirac is Spike Lee's interpretation of Aristophanes' play Lysistrata, about women who withhold sex from their men to get them to stop making war, now set against gang violence in Chicago. It's awful. It's a satire that screeches to a halt for melodrama, which you have to be really good at to pull off in the same movie, and Spike Lee does not. It's the most obnoxious and obnoxiously self-important movie I've seen all year. I was annoyed almost every single second I was watching it, and if you're interested in this movie, you should totally go watch it.
I'm not kidding. No, that's not a typo. If you want to see it, go check it out, because there's definitely nothing else like it this year, that's for sure. I hated it, but I'm glad I saw it.
There's part of me that wants to put Star Wars as the worst movie of the year. Not because it was bad, even though I think it was bad. I remember hearing some people say, oh, it's fine.
No, it's not fine. Peanuts was fine. It's sort of a throwback where they somehow just didn't manage to DreamWorks it up. It's almost a miracle. That one was fine, okay? Even the presence of Meghan Trainor on the soundtrack, when you think of it, like, oh god, not her. But then remember, her whole shtick is a throwback to the 50s and 60s doo-wop era. So that actually makes pretty much perfect sense.
We set fire to the whole expanded universe so we could make this movie? And we're going to get Star Wars movie of this weak pedigree every few years, maybe every year, until... when? Yes, they're planning a trilogy, but it's not going to stop there. It's just going to keep going and going until fatigue sets in and nobody likes Star Wars anymore. I don't want that. But then I relax for a second and remember, Star Wars cannibalized itself for far too many of its moments, but Spectre ripped off other totally inferior movies for its moments. I can throw a rock and hit 2 movies where the hero and villain have some personal connection from back in the day. Why does James Bond need that? Why does Blofeld need that? For that reason, I have to concede that Spectre is worse than The Force Awakens. But then I think, well, maybe it's because I really love James Bond, but I don't actually think Spectre is worse than Jurassic World, which is a movie I barely felt a thing about even when watching it. It's just so much nothing in my mind, like cinematic cotton candy, except it doesn't taste like anything. All of these are bad attempts at franchising, which I understand in the current movie climate, but none of these are really the worst movie of the year. They're not even worse than the other movies on the list.
What makes a movie the worst movie of the year? Well, for me, it is a movie that is not worth watching even one time. And for me, there was only one movie that was so bad and yet so forgettable and meaningless that I kept forgetting that I'd seen it when I was sort of tabulating my top 10 worst list throughout the year. And that movie, number 1 on my worst list, is Child 44.
A movie inexcusably long and unforgivably dull. It wastes the interesting performances by Tom Hardy and Noomi Rapace as the movie goes on and on, as the Soviet system continues to turn people's lives upside down to try to get them to name names over and over again. If there wasn't a silly serial killer story in the middle, they might have noticed how this movie has somebody asking someone for some names every couple of minutes, and it starts getting really repetitive. Even when the serial killer plot starts, they start to talk about how they have an idea who it might be, and they start to build up some intrigue, and then the next scene is a scene with the killer. I don't get it. There is something interesting about the notion of Russia pretending murders never happened in their perfect society, but it's lost in a totally pointless movie. According to IMDb, the first cut of this movie was 5.5 hours long. That just shows how formless and careless this whole production was. This is the first in a series of books, but I don't think we need to worry about getting a sequel to this one. I almost don't want to give it the notoriety of being the worst of the year, but it is technically worse than Me and Earl and the Dying Girl. Every other movie on this list I might bring myself to watch again. But for Child 44, I don't see the point. I think I got everything that I could get out of this movie the first time. Now, what makes the best movie of the year? The best movie of the year makes me happy, no matter what anyone else thinks of it. And you know what? I liked that Annie remake with Jamie Foxx they did. I mean, I don't like it that much. And it was technically last year, so... And I actually really enjoyed Danny Collins, but boy, is that movie ever schmaltzy. Then there are those movies that I know nobody else will like nearly as much as me, like Black Sea. Like, I love submarine movies. Or Ladrones, which is a Mexican-American comedy heist movie with Spanish subtitled in English, and English subtitled in Spanish. That was a ton of fun. I liked it more than Un Gallo con Muchos Huevos, which is the chicken boxing cartoon movie, which I liked more than either Southpaw or Creed. But boxing movies just aren't my speed. Now, if they were boxing on a submarine... I try not to use words like this in my scripted videos, but this has been a really good year for batshit. Hell and Back was a stop-motion movie about rescuing a friend out of hell. It's super weird, it's super juvenile, but I can never hate stop-motion. I wish I could have gotten to Anomalisa, but I still haven't seen it yet. It's probably too late. Then there was War Room, which I basically liked, despite the fact that I do not agree with the thesis statement of the movie at all. I could do a whole episode on War Room, so all I'll say is, it's probably about as funny as Ted 2. But I don't expect them to put that on their DVD case. Some of the Cinema Snob's friends said War Room was the worst movie of the year, and I don't get that at all. And like I already talked about it, but I really, really liked The Last Witch Hunter. That's the movie I most want to see a sequel to of anything this year, even though I bet we won't get it. And then there's Jupiter Ascending, which also has Mila Kunis in it, and she was in Hell and Back, which was about her becoming Queen of the Universe or something. I honestly don't remember, but it's exciting, and it's crazy, and it's by the Wachowskis, so I knew I was going to like it.
Okay, hang on a second. Wait, we can, talk to each other? You're not going to put Jupiter Ascending as number 1, are you? Probably not. Probably not. What, because it's weird and batshit? If you're going to do that, why don't you just put Strange Magic at the top of your list? No. You can't possibly put that as your number 1 movie of the year. You didn't like it when you first saw it. I was confused the first time I saw it. Of course you were confused. It's a jukebox musical starring fairies and goblins. I actually really like the music in this movie. There's a character named Marianne for no other reason than the fact that then they can sing Come On Marianne by the Four Seasons. Okay, would you rather she be called Eileen or Sharona? How? How can this whack-ass movie be your number 1 movie of the year? Is it just because you can't put Tinkerbell on the list? It's one of only 2 movies I saw twice this year. No, it was 3. Strange Magic, Mad Max, and Star Wars. Okay, Star Wars didn't get better when I watched it a second time.
When I first saw Strange Magic, I was baffled. I was filled with joy that something so weird had actually got made, but I recognized that the execution might leave something to be desired. It's like in Book of Life when the main character started singing Creep. Now, I think I might have been too hard on that movie, but that moment was galling. Like, what the hell were they thinking? In July, I rented Strange Magic, and as I watched it again, none of the problems I had were anywhere on my mind. Yes, this movie is very silly. Yes, it's about an honest-to-God love potion. Yes, they sing Kelly Clarkson. Yes, they do that gag where someone asks for a response from a crowd, and then you hear crickets, and then the camera pans down, and there's a cricket sitting there. Yes, she uses a blueberry to put on eyeshadow. But it's also a fun adventure with generally great music, interesting subversions of good and evil, of beautiful and ugly, who's doing what and why. And you know what? It has really good fight choreography. This movie has everything I could want. I watched it for the 3rd time just the other day, and I'm laughing at it like I've never seen it before. It's been a while, but when's the last time you saw a movie that made you that happy? On the 3rd viewing.
I don't buy a lot of DVDs anymore. I usually buy 1 a year, and that will usually end up being my favorite movie of the year. No Blu-ray release for this, which is a real shame. See, for me, the number 1 movie is the movie that makes me the happiest. And this year, that was Strange Magic. I unabashedly adore this movie. Not just in spite of its weirdness and its flaws, but because of them, I think. That's love, isn't it? Thank you, George Lucas. At least one movie this year from the mind of George Lucas actually turned out good. Thank you all for watching. One last thing. I forgot to include this in the regular video, but I cannot be bothered to set everything back up, so I'm going to put this right at the end. Everyone liked, the new Star Wars movie. I didn't. But, and this is 100% true, to me, the end of JonTron's Starcade miniseries is 50 times, 100 times more meaningful to me than everything that happens in this new Star Wars movie. But perhaps I'm just a little biased that way. So, how are we going to end this? Am I stuck here?